we've seen out of this new leadership some freshness. And these fresh ideas mean that people like Kate, Louise, and James can help the FDA mold these new programs. And so if you have the agility and the nimbleness, they are not challenges. They are opportunities for us to do more to aid our sisters and brothers who are in such desperate need.
Hello, and welcome to a very special episode of FDA Watch. I'm your host, Wayne Pines. I'm very excited about this episode. It's the first installment in another of our signature multi-episode series that we produce in collaboration with other organizations. Today's episode is the first of a 4-part series we're doing jointly with one of the truly renowned food and drug law firms. I think it's the largest boutique law firm in the FDA area. Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara. I've been honored to know all 3 of the named partners. Paul Hyman continues to come to the office every day. Jim and Phelps and Steve McNamara are deceased, but they're all top-notch lawyers, and it's the top-notch law firm. This 4-part series we're calling Pharmaceutical Regulation, Compliance, and Policy. We're going to focus on the cutting-edge issues facing pharmaceutical companies and FDA stakeholders, including those involved with rare disease, with compliance, with endorsements, with generic drugs, Hatch-Waxman, drug shortages, overseas manufacturing, and best practices for companies interacting with the agency, especially in today's fairly unusual regulatory environment. It's literally impossible to cover everything that's currently happening in the pharmaceutical and FDA area in one episode. 4 might not even be enough, but we have to start somewhere. And today we're starting with a deep dive into the rare disease space. And we have 4 really incredibly knowledgeable experts. James Valentine is a director at HBM. He spent several years at FDA helping to champion the patient voice. He now works with medical products industry and patient advocacy organization clients on a wide range of issues concerned with navigating the FDA approval gauntlet. James has helped secure FDA approvals for many new drugs across a wide spectrum of therapeutic areas. Welcome to FDA Watch, James.
Thank you, Wayne.
Next up is Frank Sazanowski. Frank is a director at HBM. I've known Frank for at least 30 years. He, I think, is generally regarded, and I certainly regard him, as the leading lawyer in the rare disease space. He's helped secure FDA approval for hundreds of new drugs, including more than 100 new molecular entities, often for serious and rare diseases. He's been involved in more than half of all the drugs that FDA has approved by way of the accelerated approval pathway outside of cancer. He's helped spearhead the implementation of the alternative effectiveness statutory standard. Frank, it's really, really great to have you. There's no better expert on rare diseases than you.
It's good to see you again, Wayne, my old friend.
Old? Wait a minute. Let's
relatively speaking, you're younger than me, maybe.
Also joining us today is Louise Himmelstrup. Louise is Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at Zevra Therapeutics. She was largely responsible for the approval of the first FDA-approved treatment for Niemann-Pick disease type C. She was also the sponsor moderator for the FDA Advisory Committee meeting on August 2nd, 2024, for a drug called arimoclomol. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Before coming to Zavar, Louise was head of global regulatory affairs at Orphazyme AS and senior regulatory project manager at Leo Pharma. Welcome to FDA Watch, Louise.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And finally, Kate McCurdy. Kate is the mother of a son with Barth syndrome, which is an ultra-rare genetic disorder. She's one of the 5 founders of the Barth Syndrome Foundation, which she founded in the year 2000. She now serves as the organization's chairman of the board. She has an MBA by training, but she was responsible for establishing the global science and medicine programs of the organizations, and she served ex officio on the group's scientific and medical advisory board for most of the time since its beginning. Unfortunately, her son succumbed to the disease at age 28, but Kate's dedication to the foundation's mission continues. Welcome to FDA Watch, Kate.
Thanks so much, Wayne. I'm delighted to be here.
We're going to talk about rare diseases, the evolving regulatory landscape. We'll be discussing a number of topics. I'm going to start out with questions to James and Frank, but I'm going to ask Louise and Kate to give us their thoughts as we progress. So we want to hear the perspective of both industry and patient advocacy. They're crucial in the rare disease space. So, James, I want to start with you and then ask Frank to chime in. Give us a brief overview of the current status of orphan drug development and approvals at FDA.
Sure. Thank you, Wayne, and thanks for having this discussion today. It's really important. Right now is an exciting time for orphan drug approvals. Over the last several years, half or close to half of all of FDA's novel drug approvals have been for rare disease indications, which is indicating that we are going in the right direction. There are drugs under review, and we're seeing at least some of them reach patients after FDA approval. At the same time, it's an important time in that we're as medical science advances and diagnostic technology advances, we're learning that many diseases are rarer and rarer. And so I know we'll talk about it at some point today, but diseases are becoming much rarer than they used to be in terms of the technologies that target them as well. And so the strategies that we had for addressing diseases that were less than 200,000 may not always nicely apply to a condition that's 30,000 or 10,000, or certainly those that are much, much rarer. And so, in this time, we're seeing also, our partners on the other side of the table at the FDA, navigating and learning themselves as well as the industry. And so, unfortunately for some programs, it results in extended timelines, many, interactions and iterations to try to work through these issues, perhaps taking even longer for some of these programs than, even, drugs intended for millions of Americans. But I think all in all, everyone around the table is really, coming in good faith, trying to work through those issues. It's just that they really are challenging. And so, because of that, I'm really excited for our conversation today.
Yeah, Frank, let me turn to you. What's your overview of what's going on with orphan products, specifically as it regards regulatory issues and the FDA?
Well, thanks, Wayne. With age comes perspective, and I really see that we're kind of almost in a second epoch of orphan drug, or second era. The first half was when I helped Marion Finkel and FDA first, establish the orphan drug law. As my research led to the 84 and 85 amendments, I wrote the implementing regulations. Many years later, after I left the FDA, I started to remind the FDA of what they were doing. That is, they were applying flexibility to their regulation of orphan drugs. And so the first era was just establishing the orphan drug program inside the FDA, getting it up and running and getting to recognize that the FDA was wisely exercising flexibility in applying regulatory standards. That was the first era. Now we're in a second era that I think we're going to talk about. And that's why, Wayne, we're also grateful to you to have this program, because talking about things like confirmatory evidence and talking about ultra rare diseases, this is the new era. And what do I mean by that? But about 3 years ago, we started to see the first evidence that the FDA was applying confirmatory evidence. That is, you could approve a drug on the basis not of 2 adequate and well-controlled positive studies, but 1 adequate and well-controlled positive study with confirmatory evidence. And this is a 1997 law, but it didn't really find traction until about 3 years ago. And we started to see it being applied by the FDA. Now, that standard applies to all drugs, not just rare diseases. It applies to all drugs. But we think it's uniquely tailored to really meet the needs of those in the community with rare conditions. The other thing that's going on that we're going to talk about is ultra rare. So on one end, confirmatory evidence applies to everything, but it finds, I think, unique application in the rare disease space. But then ultra rare. And we now see, I was the chairman of the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases that chaired, I think, the only all-day workshop on ultra-rare diseases. That was in May 2024. And we see the FDA talking about it and announcing. I was there at the National Press Club on September 3rd when the FDA announced RDEP, the Rare Disease Endpoints Principles. So we're seeing a focus not only on confirmatory evidence, which is supposed to apply to everything, every drug for every condition, but we see it's uniquely, I think, gifted for helping us in the rare disease community. And on the other end of the spectrum, we see us looking, as James was referring to, we're not really talking about those under 200,000. RDEP is for those under 1,000. So I think we're in the second era of orphan drug space, which is looking at things like the possibility of having confirmatory evidence, looking at the possibility of having unique regulatory systems for ultra rare conditions. So it's, to me, in a nutshell, Wayne, it's an exciting time, a very exciting time. So thank you for helping this program.
Well, thank you, Frank. Actually, I go back to the early 80s. I was at FDA when the first rare disease program was set up. I actually helped set it up, helped select Marion Finkel to head it up. That was even before the law was passed. We had an orphan drug office because increasingly orphan drugs were recognized as a special category that needed special attention. I think the agency continues and has since then given special attention. I want to turn to...
And Wayne, on that point, PMA, those of us who were around, we remember you at FDA asking PMA, the predecessor to pharma, to come out with a report on drugs of limited commercial significance. So that was before we even had a term called orphan drugs or rare disease. They were called drugs of limited commercial significance. And so thank you, Wayne, for doing all that spade work of getting it going inside the FDA.
Well, I always regarded orphan drugs as being a personal priority. I don't have any relatives who have rare diseases, but as you know, I've been involved with NORD since the beginning of NORD. I want to turn to a discussion of confirmatory evidence. James and Frank, you both mentioned that. First, let's define it. What is confirmatory evidence, and why is this a particularly relevant topic for rare disease development programs? James, let me start with you on that.
Yeah, and I think Frank teed this up nicely, as part of reflecting on where we're at in orphan product development. But as a food and drug lawyer, this is actually kind of a fun question because it's, as Frank alluded, this is something that has been around. Confirmatory evidence has been part of the pathway to demonstrating what the law calls substantial evidence of effectiveness, establishing a drug's benefit. And so, historically, FDA would require under the law 2 adequate and well-controlled studies to establish that drug benefit. As Frank noted, in 1997, we got FDAMA, specifically Section 115, that added to the law and said, hey, there's this alternative way that you can have a product be approved with a single adequate and well-controlled study, plus this thing that was not defined in the law, confirmatory evidence. Right on the heels of that, FDA issued guidance in 1998. It was their clinical effectiveness guidance. And, any conversation that you had with FDA about substantial evidence after that point in time, FDA, they would say, well, our guidance implements that law. It was very interesting that they would say that, given that the words confirmatory evidence never showed up in that guidance. But so it went. And if you went in and you wanted to talk to FDA with the rare disease program and propose a single study, they'd say, well, look at our guidance. It says you need a highly statistically persuasive result in your single study. Sadly, for rare diseases, we talk about, difficult challenges in rare diseases. Powering studies is a challenge. And, even getting, a p-value that's under the traditional p of 0.05 is really hard. And so, to expect to, have the only way to have a single study approval being a much lower p-value essentially would rule out a single study approval path for rare diseases. Now, fortunately, FDA has a long history of being, as Frank, helped define it, flexible in rare diseases. We sometimes, jokingly say we're asking FDA to color outside of the lines, but and they've done that historically, even over the decades. But it really wasn't until 2019, after advocating to FDA with many of our clients, having individual discussions, going and advocating before Congress as part of 21st Century Cures Act, that really finally led the agency to issue new guidance on substantial evidence and actually, did change its tune and put confirmatory evidence, as an alternative single study path. So really, the idea behind confirmatory evidence is simple. It's rather than having a second study help confirm the results of the first positive study to ensure that we're not having a false positive or type 1 error, we're using other things. So, a common nomenclature would be supportive evidence. And what might that supportive evidence be? It might be non-clinical studies that evaluate the drug's mechanism. It might be pharmacodynamic evidence from the clinical program. It might be natural history information. And I know we're going to talk about some of those approaches, but now, because of that new, relatively new guidance, a sponsor can go into FDA and actually articulate their confirmatory evidence. And rather than FDA shake their head, they have a common language to have that discussion.
Yeah, Frank, I want to turn to you. How often do you see confirmatory evidence being applied? And how is it being applied right now by FDA?
This is why we say we're in the second era of rare disease with this confirmatory evidence, because the law was enacted in 1997. It actually came out of the work of a former FDA Center Director, Carl Peck. He was the one who advocated for this, and it became law in 1997. Then Carl held the only workshop that's ever been held on confirmatory evidence on that new law. He published a paper on that workshop in 2002. And he asked Janet Woodcock and I to co-chair the breakout session that was to help define confirmatory evidence, which is the key phrase. And so this has been around a long time. But what I'm saying with how frequently, I could only find 2 instances that anybody inside the FDA ever referred to confirmatory evidence before the December 2019 guidance. And there was one, Rusty Katz did it once for a drug for a rare seizure disorder. And then Bob Temple did it once for a pulmonary hypertension drug. But so when you ask how frequently, it was almost never. You can say almost never. People like James and I would bring it up, but the FDA would, as James said, would refer us back to their May 1998 clinical evidence of effectiveness guidance and says that fully implemented the 97 law. And I guess I didn't tell Janet Woodcock and my good friend Bob Temple enough times that the word confirmatory evidence, that phrase, is not in your 1998 guidance. You need a new guidance. And somewhere, maybe after kind of our weekly tennis matches, that I battered Bob Temple enough times that to convince him to come out with a new guidance document, that somewhere around 2009, Bob said, "We're working on it, Frank. We're working on it." And it came out in December 2019. So it took a long time. But now, what's so amazing is that I cannot go and James cannot go. We cannot go into a meeting with the FDA almost without talking about a rare disease therapy, where the FDA doesn't bring up in their preliminary comments to what the company's proposing is, what are you going to do about confirmatory evidence? So now we went from a situation in which the law was created in 97. We couldn't get anybody inside the FDA to pay attention to it. And now, since the guidance first came out in December 2019 with a elaboration on it in September 2023, now it's hard to stop the FDA from talking about it. They want you to come in and start talking about it early and often. And it's very important for them to do that. The challenge for sponsors and patient advocates is if you go in too early, you don't really have mechanistic information, pharmacodynamic information. You're still gathering it in your proof of concept. So you're talking hypothetically, and we know hypothetically doesn't really do much for you inside the FDA. They're empiricists, so they want data. But then if you go in too late, at like the end of phase 2 meeting, the FDA says, you should have come in earlier and start talking to us about your confirmatory evidence. So I know that's a situation Kate has encountered with Barth. And I think Luis also encountered that with Niemann Pick. So I'll stop there, but I hope that answers your question, Wayne.
Yeah. And Louise, I want to turn to you. You helped navigate the approval of the first ever drug approved for Niemann-Pick disease type C, which of course is an ultra rare disease. There was a complete response letter which focused on substantial evidence of effectiveness, but it was in large part focused on the confirmatory evidence to support a single positive study. There was an advisory committee meeting, and it focused not on the primary clinical evidence, but on questions about confirmatory evidence. Louise, I'd like you to revisit this, and in light of what James and Frank have been saying, provide your retrospective views of the process that you went through for this drug.
The regulatory journey for arimoclomol perfectly illustrates how confirmatory evidence has been introduced and has evolved in FDA reviews. I think we had our pre-NDA discussions around the time when the 2019 draft guidance was published, and confirmatory evidence was not a theme. It was not discussed in our interactions with the agency at that point. And then 1 to 2 years later, we received what I think was the first, if one of the first, or if not the first, complete response letter mentioning confirmatory evidence to substantiate effectiveness. It did not ask for another pivotal study, which would have been extremely difficult in this disease. So to me, this shows the FDA's attention to the regulatory challenges for ultra-rare diseases with high unmet need and very few patients available for clinical studies, and especially the need for regulatory flexibility. So there is now a more formalized regulatory path combining one adequate trial with confirmatory evidence. But the 2019 guidance, it mentions confirmatory evidence, but without any details. So there was limited guidance to us to navigate this confirmatory evidence. But we focused our resubmission on presenting multiple sources of confirmatory evidence that had been collected during our development program and also in the time after the complete response letter. And just a few months before we submitted or resubmitted the NDA, the 2023 draft guidance came out, and that is really elaborating on the sources of confirmatory evidence you can use to substantiate effectiveness. And what is interesting here is how we then see that being, a roadmap or a tool for the regulators to navigate, but also a tool for us to navigate confirmatory evidence. So we were able to sort of shape our application according to that. And interestingly, when we came to the GEMDAC advisory committee meeting, the voting question was about confirmatory evidence. So it was about whether the committee thought that the pivotal trial in concert with the confirmatory evidence was enough evidence to substantiate effectiveness. So I think this approval demonstrates the willingness from the agency to apply principles for one adequate and well-controlled trial together with confirmatory evidence.
Yeah, if I'm reading the statements of the present leaders of FDA, the new people who have come in this past year. I think they are very supportive of the concept of confirmatory evidence to support applications. Frank, is that your read as well?
It is my view as well. Yeah. So that it's I think that we're going to see. My prediction would be we're going to continue to see a growth in the FDA interest in looking at confirmatory evidence, especially as it applies to rare diseases.
And if that plays into real world evidence and that concept as well.
Yes.
Real world evidence is one type, is one type of confirmatory evidence. Yeah.
Right. I want to move on to another topic, accelerated approval. Let me start out with James here. Are there new ways in which sponsors and FDA are engaging with accelerated approval? There's been a lot of publicity about accelerated approval over the past few years, including before this year, before the present leadership came in. But can you just generally talk about accelerated approval and how you see it being applied in the rare disease space?
Sure, Wayne. And there's probably so much we could talk about here. We could have a whole episode of this podcast just on accelerated approval. But maybe to comment on one area that certainly looking back, and you mentioned Frank, in my experience with accelerated approvals over time, if you look at all of those, the vast majority of those have been based off of surrogate biomarkers. The classic accelerated approval endpoint. If I'm looking at, some, more so recent approvals and the pipeline of drugs in development that Frank and I are aiding on, one thing that we're certainly seeing is more consideration of intermediate clinical endpoints as the basis of accelerated approval. So, in the accelerated approval regulations, and now statute, FDA is able to approve not just on surrogate biomarkers, which are, things like dystrophin or reducing toxic metabolites and lysosomal storage diseases, but looking at actual clinical outcome assessments. So things like performance measures and clinician reported outcomes, things that maybe aren't yet clinically meaningful, either because it's something that's seen earlier in a disease process that still is itself predictive of clinical benefit, maybe much like a surrogate, but also some outcomes that just require long-term effect to be considered meaningful. That would be something like, the Northera approval in 2014 for orthostatic hypotension, where short-term dizziness was observed and demonstrated, but FDA felt that long-term dizziness needed to be confirmed at later time points to be meaningful. So we're seeing this, these clinical outcomes that change a little bit earlier or more sensitive maybe than the ultimate clinical outcomes, be part of the discussion and dialogue. Recently, for example, PTC's gene therapy for AADC deficiency was approved on early gross motor milestone achievement, presumably with the idea that it will predict attainment of further milestones down the road for those kids and young adults. And so it really opens up a new frontier for accelerated approval to not just focus on surrogates, and which is important because many diseases aren't, rare diseases aren't fortunate enough to have a, good targeted, surrogate biomarker. But accelerated approval is such an important tool to get drugs to patients earlier. So we're really exploring this new idea of intermediate clinical endpoints as a way to get there.
Yeah, Kate, you and the Barth community have experience with this. You advocated for the approval of the first ever drug for Barth, which again is an ultra rare disease. There was a complete response letter, and FDA offered Stealth Biotherapeutics a path forward for accelerated approval based on an intermediate clinical endpoint. Can you talk a little bit about that? And just generally, how do you see accelerated approval as a tool to facilitate access for rare disease communities?
Sure, Wayne, I'm happy to do that. When a disease is ultra rare, and so by definition has just very few patients, as has been said already on this podcast, I think accelerated really can be an important pathway, accelerated approval. And we have, as everybody has pointed out, we have just benefited from this relatively new intermediate clinical endpoint approach to it. We were just within the last month granted accelerated approval with a follow-on study for a knee extensor muscle test, which in and of itself, they say, does not necessarily prove clinical improvement, but they think it's a byway, if you will, a biomarker, a milestone toward that. And so if we can prove the link from that to actual clinical improvement, then that's wonderful. So, and the various studies and the registries and stuff post-marketing to gather additional data for more patients obviously help corroborate findings. And so we're all for that. The one thing I'd say, however, is that I do think this process needs to reflect its name and actually be accelerated. We and the sponsor of this drug have been at this journey, on this journey since 2014. And the program was granted all kinds of designations to support it: fast track, orphan drug, rare pediatric, and ultimately priority review. And it should not take 11 years to get where we finally are today. In that time period, I have to mention that we've lost 18% of our living population, and we just do not have the luxury of time. So we're very grateful that we're finally here. But I do think the accelerated part of accelerated approval needs to get its due.
Can I say something here, Wayne, that I just want to have a shout out to all patient advocates, but I'll do it in the person of Kate McCurdy and the Barth Syndrome Foundation, because it was Kate who came to James and my client Stealth and said, we've looked at your mechanism of action, and your mechanism of action is a lock and key with our disease pathophysiology, with the very etiology of our condition. We are begging you to look at your drug in the context of our population, because it looks like it's a perfect fit. And this is another illustration of, it's not necessarily sponsors who have this, kind of genius for spotting therapies that are going to aid our sisters and brothers suffering, but it's the patient advocates who know the community and who are vigilant, watching for every development in science that might bring hope to their community. And so just a huge shout out to Kate on behalf of all patient advocates who are doing the same thing with each of their diseases. So thank you, Kate.
That's very kind, Frank. You're right. When we saw that, we got very excited because it just seemed like a no-brainer. Ours was the only disease that was known to have a primary defect in exactly the mechanism that this drug was targeting. And so we approached them and said, "You've probably never heard of Barth syndrome, but we need to tell you about it." And they agreed, and off we went. But it's been a long journey.
I want to come back to this after our break. We're going to take a quick break right now. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back, and we'll be talking about ultra-rare pathways. I'm going to ask Kate to reflect still further on her experience with the Barth syndrome drug. And we're back. We're talking to James Valentine and Frank Sazanowski of HPM, Louise Himmelstrup of Zevra Therapeutics, and Kate McCurdy of the Barth Syndrome Foundation. And we're going to discuss ultra-rare disease pathways. And Kate, I want to ask you to reflect from your community's journey that might help us understand why you think ultra-rare diseases like Barth face such challenges from a regulatory standpoint.
Oh gosh, I could talk for hours about this, but let me just start with a few points. I'll try to give a little color commentary on a couple of points. The road certainly has been challenging, and our approval is hot off the press since it was granted less than a month ago. So we're still very much on this journey. So my comments are from the trenches. But it's perfectly clear that the fundamental issue here is one of numbers. Rare diseases are difficult enough, but ultra-rare diseases face even more significant hurdles because by very definition, there literally are just so few patients who exist to participate in clinical trials. In Barth syndrome, for example, there are currently only 152 patients alive in the US, and it was much less than that when the trial started. And so for diseases like ours, in which there is no founder population, there are only very few patients, and these are geographically dispersed. And lots of them are pediatric because most of them don't survive until adulthood. And many can get very sick very suddenly, so travel can be a real hurdle. These are just facts, you know? But the question then is, given all this, how does the system deal with the stark reality of a tiny pool that we have to draw on from clinical trials? So, Wayne, you mentioned that our community has advocated for the approval that was just granted, and we have, because we're a very tight-knit community and we know each other well, and we've seen with our very own eyes the amazing benefits this drug can offer. But honestly, I think a better description of what we've done actually is to educate both legislators and those at the FDA, because there really isn't a deep appreciation or understanding of the challenges that we face. And Frank was talking about educating pharma. We did that too, but education, I think, is a huge component of the ultra rare disease journey. I've participated in every FDA meeting that the drug sponsor has held in the last 5 years or so. And my goal all along has been to help the agency better understand our predicament and the patient's valuable perspectives. But there have been several times when I've been accused by the FDA, and that's a strong word, but honestly, it's true, of wanting the agency to lower their standards for us. And I've told them that I actually disagree with that characterization. As a patient of an ultra rare son, I'm in complete alignment with the FDA that the goal of drug development is for safe and effective therapies for the patients who need them. I have no interest in gaining access to a drug that is not safe or not effective. But I do think it's incumbent on those who review the data to be a little bit more creative in how they do their analysis and what they consider for their review. We just talked about some new approaches with confirmatory evidence. But let me explain just a little bit more. In the US, when the first of the two clinical trials that were done in our disease for this drug were initiated, there were only 103 living Barth patients. Only 37 of them were at least 12 years of age, which they had to be for this trial, and did not have a heart transplant or an internal defibrillator paced. 37. And then that already tiny pool actually was further reduced by some other exclusion criteria. So the randomized double-blind placebo-controlled crossover trial that finally was conducted was fully enrolled, which is amazing, but it only had 12 patients. So at several points through the review process, we were told, gee, there just is not enough data and we just need to go find more patients. But they literally do not exist. So I explained to the FDA what we'd done, all the things we'd done to find new patients. And I reminded them that the 12 patients in the study actually represented at least, and probably more, than a third of all those who possibly could have participated in the trial. That's huge. That's an enormous proportion of our eligible cohort. And yet we were told it was not enough. So, I whirred and buzzed and I said, gee, if that number had been applied to the diabetic community, it would be this many millions in a trial, to point out what a large proportion that was. I further explained that if the FDA combined all their patient interactions that they'd had with Barth families through our PFDD meeting and multiple listening sessions that we held and all of the EAP applications that they'd received, and during our own AdCom open public hearing, the FDA had gotten information directly from more than a third of the entire living population of the United States of any age and medical status. And that's just huge. So this is all to say that I firmly believe that the input that the FDA gets from patients cannot just be considered as anecdotal. Patient experience should be given more than lip service and really considered as critical clinical data.
Louise, let me ask you, Niemann-Pick disease type C is also ultra rare. what lessons, I'm going to ask you briefly because we have to wind down a little bit here. What lessons did you learn that you would offer to any company developing a drug for an ultra rare indication?
I think where we are now, every regulatory strategy for a rare disease that are considering doing one adequate and well-controlled trial must consider or include confirmatory evidence. So the draft guidance still from 2023 still talks about if you have very convincing results from your clinical trial, you need less convincing data from confirmatory evidence and vice versa. But since you're not able to plan for a very convincing p-value before you know the results, then you have to prepare for confirmatory evidence. And as an example, we use non-clinical data as one of our confirmatory evidence pieces. And a learning here is that you should conduct these and you should consider them, plan them, and report them to a regulatory quality standard so you can use them as confirmatory evidence. And then I will, as Kate said, I will say you need to work together with your patient community. That is really important in these rare diseases. So bring them to all meetings and listen and give them the opportunity to speak, because they are the true expert, and then they can sort of bridge between you and the regulators. So that's my lessons learned.
Thank you. I want to conclude by asking James and Frank, this is the easiest question you'll ever get in your whole career. What haven't we covered? Do you have any comments that you want to make before we end this discussion? James, let me turn to you and then Frank.
Thank you, Wayne. So there's, obviously so much that we haven't covered about rare disease in today's discussion. But I, want to follow up on something that I think, Kate was alluding to, and Louise as well, about this ultra rare discussion, which is just, that, the FDA regulatory framework really is not, we've learned that it wasn't designed for rare diseases. We've talked about how it evolved with confirmatory evidence. That has, helped a lot in terms of making, traditional rare disease programs, more feasible. As we move into this ultra rare disease, setting, we really are, now in this new era of needing to understand, how to, for example, demonstrate benefit and, even traditional hypothesis testing, and designing studies to enable that, with randomization with such small populations. Does that really cure imbalances? Should we be thinking about, single arm, patient as their own control trial designs, as the starting point in ultra rare? When we're talking about hypothesis testing, why are we starting with P of 0.05? Why aren't we talking about a higher P value, or maybe getting rid of p-values altogether, and looking at, qualitatively? When we're talking about 12 patients, the FDA clinical team can roll up their sleeves and judge whether, how many of those 12 patients had some type of benefit, in the study itself. And so I think, we're kind of, to use a phrase Kate said, in the trenches right now, working with, sponsors, navigating that. And I think it'll be interesting. Maybe we'll have to do a follow up, podcast in a couple of years, and explore what, how have we seen this landscape change in the ultra rare setting.
Frank, same question. Final thoughts.
Yeah. Final thoughts is that just as I started, I'm saying this is an exciting time, Wayne, that in rare diseases, because look, I was there at the National Press Club September 3rd, where Commissioner McCary, Doctors Tidmarsh and Prasad announced the Rare Disease Endpoints Principles, RDEP initiative, for those diseases affecting fewer than 1,000 Americans. And this is very exciting, but it's all very new. It's kind of unformed. We have an opportunity as patient advocates like Kate and sponsor advocates like Louise and just good counsel like James. We have an opportunity to help mold, because this is all very fresh. Like, it announced that you should come in under RDEP when you have a protocol that's going to be for your pivotal registration trial and RDEP. FDA will help you try to find a comparator, maybe a baseline control, a natural history, try to come up with some way to address the issues Kate was just addressing. But you know what? I predict that in the future, RDEP is going to be expanded way beyond that. We'll talk about studies that are already underway. We'll talk about how much safety data do you need for these under the RDEP principles. And it's the same thing with the Commissioner's National Priority Voucher Program that was announced earlier this year. I'm helping companies address things like autism, PTSD, opioid addiction, psychedelics, and even some rare diseases under that program. So I think these programs, these initiatives, from my time, and I joined the FDA a little later than you, Wayne. I joined in 83. But if I look over the warp and weave of all my time, unless there's been some public health crisis like 2020 with COVID and we got Operation Warp Speed, or the 80s when I was there and we were dealing with the AIDS crisis and we got accelerated approval. You can go back to thalidomide, why we got the 62 law. But what I see out of this set of leadership is I see innovation coming out that's not driven by a public health crisis. These things like RDEP, there was no public health crisis. The Commissioner's National Priority Voucher Program, there was no crisis that sparked that. These were kind of regulatory innovations that are de novo, ab initio, coming out of them. They claim sometimes to be disruptors. Well, they are being disruptors. And the FDA has lost hundreds of years of institutional memory in the last 12 months. Just my friend Bob Temple, when he retired last December, they lost over 50 years of institutional memory. So, but what's happened is we've seen out of this new leadership some freshness. And these fresh ideas mean that people like Kate, Louise, and James can help the FDA mold these new programs. And so if you have the agility and the nimbleness to kind of work with these, they are not challenges. They are opportunities for us to do more to aid our sisters and brothers who are in such desperate need. So thank you, Wayne. And as I always say, onward.
That's a wonderful way to conclude this podcast. There are innovations. Rare diseases, orphan drugs is a priority for this administration. They have said so many times. They're trying to be disruptive. They're trying to be innovators. It's clear that we're going to need another podcast on this fairly soon to keep up with all the developments. But I want to thank our guests, James, Frank, Louise, Kate, for speaking so effectively and so eloquently about what's happening in the rare disease space. This is a wonderful way to start this 4-part series, which we're doing in collaboration with Hyman Phelps and McNamara HPM. I also want to thank our podcast creator and executive producer, Michael Levin Epstein, our assistant producer, Sam Hoffmeister. If you want to find out more about the podcast, visit our website, fdawatch.net, fdawatch.net. And we know you don't want to miss parts 2, 3, and 4 of this series or any episode of FDA Watch. The only way to assure that you'll be informed when one appears is to subscribe to the podcast. Go to fdawatch.net, go to the bottom of the page. There's a place for you to put your email address. You press submit, and it's free, and you will be notified whenever we have a podcast. Our podcast is growing exponentially. We had closer to 10,000 downloads. That's because so many people have chosen to be subscribers, and we welcome still more subscribers. So as we say at the end of every episode of FDA Watch, if you really want to watch what FDA is doing, listen to FDA Watch.